Part 3 of Oroonoko. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Oroonoko, or the Royal Slave, by Aphra Behn. Part 3. While Oroonoko felt all the agonies of love, and suffered under a torment the most painful in the world, the old king was not exempted from his share of affliction. He was troubled for having been forced, by an irresistible passion, to rob his son of a treasure he knew could not but be extremely dear to him, since she was the most beautiful that ever had been seen, and had besides all the sweetness and innocence of youth and modesty, with a charm of wit surpassing all. He found that, however she was forced to expose her lovely person to his withered arms, she could only sigh and weep there, and think only of Oroonoko, and sometimes could not forbear speaking of him, though her life were, by custom, forfeited by owning her passion. But she spoke not of a lover only, but of a prince dear to him whom she spoke, and of the praises of a man who, till now, filled the old man's soul with joy at every recital of his bravery, or even his name. And 'twas this dotage on our young hero that gave Amoinda 1,000 privileges to speak of him without offending, and this condescension in the old king that made her take the satisfaction of speaking of him so very often. Besides, he many times inquired how the prince bore himself, and those of whom he asked, being entirely slaves to the merits and virtues of the prince, still answered what they thought conduced best to his service, which was, to make the old king fancy that the prince had no more interest in Amoinda, and had resigned her willingly to the pleasure of the king, that he diverted himself with his mathematicians, his fortifications, his officers, and his hunting. This pleased the old lover, who failed not to report these things again to Amoinda, that she might, by the example of her young lover, withdraw her heart, and rest better contented in his arms. But, however she was forced to receive this unwelcome news, in all appearance with unconcern and content, her heart was bursting within, and she was only happy when she could get alone, to vent her griefs and moans with sighs and tears. What reports of the prince's conduct were made to the king, he thought good to justify as far as possibly he could by his actions, and when he appeared in the presence of the king, he showed a face not at all betraying his heart, so that, in a little time, the old man, being entirely convinced that he was no longer a lover of Amoinda, he carried him with him, in his train, to the Otan, often to banquet with his mistresses. But as soon as he entered, one day, into the apartment of Amoinda, with the king, at the first glance from her eyes, notwithstanding all his determined resolution, he was ready to sink in the place where he stood, and had certainly done so but for the support of Aboan, a young man who was next to him, which with his change of countenance had betrayed him, had the king chanced to look that way. And I have observed 'tis a very great error in those who laugh when one says, a negro can change colour. For I have seen him as frequently blush and look pale, and that as visibly as I ever saw in the most beautiful white. And 'tis certainly that both these changes were evident this day in both these lovers. And Amoinda, who saw with some joy the change in the prince's face and found it in her own, strove to divert the king from beholding either, by a forced caress with which she met him, which was a new wound in the heart of the poor dying prince. But as soon as the king was busied in looking on some fine thing of Amoinda's making, she had time to tell the prince, with her angry but love-darting eyes, that she resented his coldness, and bemoaned her own miserable captivity. Nor were his eyes silent, but answered hers again, as much as eyes could do, instructed by the most tender and most passionate heart that ever loved. And they spoke so well, and so effectually, as Amoinda no longer doubted but she was the only delight and darling of the soul she found pleading in him in its right of love, which none was more willing to resign than she. And 'twas this powerful language alone that in an instant conveyed all the thoughts of their souls to each other, that they both found there wanted but opportunity to make them both entirely happy. But when he saw another door opened by Onahal, a former old wife of the king's, who now had charge of Amoinda, and saw the prospect of a bed of state made ready, with sweets and flowers for the dalliance of the king, who immediately led the trembling victim from his sight into that prepared repose, what rage, what wild frenzy seized his heart, which forcing to keep within bounds and to suffer without noise, it became the more insupportable, and rent his soul with 10,000 pains. He was forced to retire to vent his groans, where he fell down upon a carpet and lay struggling a long time, and only breathing now and then, "O Imoinda!" When Onahal had finished her necessary affair within, shutting the door, she came forth, to wait till the king cooled, and hearing some one sighing in the other room, she passed on and found the prince in that deplorable condition which she thought needed her aid. She gave him cordials, but all in vain, till finding the nature of his disease by his sighs and naming Imoinda, she told him he had not so much cause as he imagined to afflict himself, for if he knew the king so well as she did, he would not lose a moment in jealousy, and that she was confident that Imoinda bore at this moment part in his affliction. Arboan was of the same opinion, and both together persuaded him to reassume his courage. And all sitting down on the carpet, the prince said so many obliging things to Onahal that he half persuaded her to be of his party, and she promised him she would thus far comply with his just desires, that she would let Imoinda know how faithful he was, what he suffered, and what he said. This discourse lasted till the king called, which gave Oroonoko a certain satisfaction, and with the hope Onahal had made him conceive, he assumed to look as gay as 'twas possible a man in his circumstances could do, and presently after he was called in with the rest who waited without. The king commanded music to be brought, and several of his young wives and mistresses came all together by his command to dance before him, where Imoinda performed her part with an air and grace so surpassing all the rest as her beauty was above 'em, and received the present ordained as a prize. The prince was every moment more charmed with the new beauties and graces he beheld in this fair one, and while he gazed, and she danced, Onahal was retired to a window with Arboan. This Onahal, as I said, was one of the caste mistresses of the old king, and 'twas these, now past their beauty, that were made guardians or gouvernantes of the young and new ones, and whose business it was to teach them all those wanton arts of love with which they prevailed and charmed heretofore in their turn, and who now treated the triumphing happy ones with all the severity as to liberty and freedom that was possible, in revenge of their honours they robbed them of, envying them those satisfactions, those gallantries and presents that were once made to themselves while youth and beauty lasted, and which they now saw pass, as it were regardless by, and paid only to the bloomings. And certainly nothing is more afflicting to a decayed beauty than to behold in itself declining charms that were once adored, and to find those caresses paid to new beauties to which she once laid claim, to hear them whisper as she passes by that once was a delicate woman. Those abandoned ladies therefore endeavour to revenge all the despites and decays of time on these flourishing happy ones, and 'twas this severity that gave Oroonoko 1,000 fears he should never prevail with Onahal to see Imoinda. But, as I said, she was now retired to a window with Arboan. This young man was not only one of the best quality, but a man extremely well made and beautiful, and coming often to attend the king to the Otan, he had subdued the heart of the antiquated Onahal, which had not forgot how pleasant it was to be in love. And though she had some decays in her face, she had none in her sense and wit. She was therefore agreeable still, even to Arboan's youth, so that he took pleasure in entertaining her with discourses of love. He also knew that to make his court to these she-favourites was the way to be great, these being the persons that do all affairs and business at court. He had also observed that she had given him glances more tender and inviting than she had done to others of his quality. And now, when he saw that her favour could so absolutely oblige the prince, he failed not to sigh in her ear, and to look with eyes all soft upon her, and gave her hope that she had made some impressions on his heart. He found her pleased at this, and making 1,000 advances to him, but the ceremony ending, and the king departing, broke up the company for that day and his conversation. Arboan failed not that night to tell the prince of his success, and how advantageous the service of Onahal might be to his amour with Imoinda. The prince was overjoyed with this good news, and besought him, if it were possible, to caress her so as to engage her entirely, which he could not fail to do if he complied with her desires. For then, said the prince, her life lying at your mercy, she must grant you the request you make in my behalf. Aboan understood him, and assured him he would make love so effectually that he would defy the most expert mistress of the art to find out whether he dissembled it or had it really. And 'twas with impatience they waited the next opportunity of going to the Otan. The wars came on, the time of taking the field approached, and 'twas impossible for the prince to delay his going at the head of his army to encounter the enemy, so that every day seemed a tedious year till he saw his Amoinda. For he believed he could not live if he were forced away without being so happy. 'Twas with impatience, therefore, that he expected the next visit the king would make, and according to his wish it was not long. The parley of the eyes of these two lovers had not passed so secretly but an old jealous lover could spy it, or rather he wanted not flatterers who told him they observed it, so that the prince was hastened to the camp, and this was the last visit he found he should make to the Otan. He therefore urged Aboan to make the best of this last effort, and to explain himself so to Onahal, that she, deferring her enjoyment of her young lover no longer, might make way for the prince to speak to Amoinda. The whole affair being agreed on between the prince and Aboan, they attended the king, as the custom was, to the Otan, where, while the whole company was taken up in beholding the dancing, and antic postures the woman royal made to divert the kind, Onahal singled out Aboan, whom she found most pliable to her wish. When she had him where she believed she could not be heard, she sighed to him and softly cried, "Ah, Aboan, when will you be sensible of my passion? I confess it with my mouth, because I would not give my eyes the lie, and you have but too much already perceived they have confessed my flame. Nor would I have you believe that, because I am the abandoned mistress of a king, I esteem myself altogether divested of charms. No, Aboan, I have still a rest of beauty enough engaging, and have learned to please too well not to be desirable. I can have lovers still, but will have none but Aboan." "Madam," replied the half-feigning youth, "you have already by my eyes found you can still conquer, and I believe 'tis in pity of me you condescend to this kind confession. But, madam, words are used to be so small a part of our country courtship that 'tis rare one can get so happy an opportunity as to tell one's heart, and those few minutes we have are forced to be snatched for more certain proofs of love than speaking and sighing, and such I languish for." He spoke this with such a tone that she hoped it true, and could not forbear believing it, and being wholly transported with joy for having subdued the finest of all the king's subjects to her desires, she took from her ears 2 large pearls, and commanded him to wear 'em in his. He would have refused 'em, crying, "Madam, these are not the proofs of your love that I expect. 'Tis opportunity, 'tis a lone hour only that can make me happy." But forcing the pearls into his hand, she whispered softly to him, "Oh, do not fear a woman's invention when love sets her a-thinking." And pressing his hand, she cried, "This night you shall be happy. Come to the gate of the orange grove behind the Otan, and I will be ready about midnight to receive you." 'Twas thus agreed, and she left him, that no notice might be taken of their speaking together. The ladies were still dancing, and the king, laid on a carpet, with a great deal of pleasure was beholding them, especially Amoinda, who that day appeared more lovely than ever, being enlivened with the good tidings Onahal had brought her, of the constant passion the prince had for her. The prince was laid on another carpet at the other end of the room, with his eyes fixed on the object of his soul, and as she turned or moved, so did they, and she alone gave his eyes and soul their motions. Nor did Amoinda employ her eyes to any other use than in beholding with infinite pleasure the joy she produced in those of the prince. But while she was more regarding him than the step she took, she chanced to fall, and so near him, as that, leaping with extreme force from the carpet, he caught her in his arms as she fell, and was visible to the whole presence the joy wherewith he received her. He clasped her close to his bosom, and quite forgot that reverence that was due to the mistress of a king, and that punishment that is the reward of a boldness of this nature. And had not the presence of mind of Amoinda, fonder of his safety than her own, befriended him in making her spring from his arms and fall into her dance again, he had at that instant met his death, for the old king, jealous to the last degree, rose up in rage, broke all the diversion, and led Amoinda to her apartment, and sent out word to the prince to go immediately to the camp, and that if he were found another night in court he should suffer the death ordained for disobedient offenders. You may well imagine how welcome this news was to Oroonoko. whose unseasonable transport and caress of Amoinda was blamed by all men that loved him. And now he perceived his fault, yet cried that for such another moment he would be content to die. All the Otan was in disorder about this accident, and Onahal was particularly concerned, because on the prince's stay depended her happiness, for she could no longer expect that of Aboan; so that ere they departed, they contrived it so that the prince and he should both come that night to the grove of the Otan, which is all oranges and citrons, and there they would wait her orders. They parted thus with grief enough till night, leaving the king in possession of the lovely maid. But nothing could appease the jealousy of the old lover. He would not be imposed on, but would have it that Amoinda made a false step on purpose to fall into Oroonoko's bosom, and that all things looked like a design on both sides. And 'twas in vain she protested her innocence. He was old and obstinate, and left her more than half assured that his fear was true. The king, going to his apartment, sent to know where the prince was, and if he intended to obey his command. The messenger returned and told him he found the prince pensive and altogether unprepared for the campaign, that he lay negligently on the ground and answered very little. This confirmed the jealousy of the king, and he commanded that they should very narrowly and privately watch his motions, and that he should not stir from his apartment, but one spy or other should be employed to watch him, so that the hour approaching wherein he was to go to the citron grove, and taking only Aboan along with him, he leaves his apartment, and was watched to the very gate of the Otan, where he was seen to enter, and where they left him, to carry back the tidings to the king. Oroonoko and Aboan were no sooner entered, but Onahal led the prince to the apartment of Amoinda, who, not knowing anything of her happiness, was laid in bed. But Onahal only left him in her chamber, to make the best of his opportunity, and took her dear Aboan to her own, where he showed the height of complaisance for his prince, when, to give him an opportunity, he suffered himself to be caressed in bed by Onahal. The prince softly wakened Amoinda, who was not a little surprised with joy to find him there, and yet she trembled with 1,000 fears. I believe he omitted saying nothing to this young maid that might persuade her to suffer him to seize his own and take the rights of love, and I believe she was not long resisting those arms where she so longed to be, and having opportunity, night, and silence, youth, love, and desire, he soon prevailed, and ravished in a moment what his old grandfather had been endeavouring for so many months. End of Part 3.